Today we have two giants of early 20th century chess, Jose Raul Capablanca and Akiba Rubinstein. And Rubinstein is one of those players that is in that category of greatest player to never become world champion. That's a very select group, and he is in it. Capablanca, of course, was world champion, and both have been given the Grandmaster title posthumously. So let's jump right in and see this very intense battle between two of the strongest players of their era. Capablanca has white, Rubinstein has black. Let us jump right in. D4, D5, and knight F3 from Capablanca. Maybe he's going to play a queen's pawn game like the Kali or London system, but Rubinstein responds with C5 himself, liberating his queen and directly attacking the center. Capablanca goes ahead and takes that pawn. Now E6, so black can recapture. Yes, white can defend with B4, but that leads to a messy position that black does pretty well in. So Capablanca plays E4. He could play C4 or E4, but he has to challenge black's center, which he does, and it would be a mistake for black to take on E4, because then Capablanca would just exchange queens and knight to G5, where you can see he's threatening knight to F7 check, which forks the king and the rook, and when black defends that, he can then take on E4 and defend the C5 pawn. White would just be better. So Rubinstein doesn't mess with that. He just goes ahead and takes on C5. Capablanca takes on D5, and we very quickly get our structure established. This is an isolated queen's pawn structure where white is going to try to control this square in front of the pawn, this D4 square, get it fixed, and then attack the pawn. Black wants to use this pawn as a lever for attack. Sometimes on the king's side, the knight can come to E4 perhaps. He wants to use these two open files, the open E file or half open C file. So bishop to B5 check from Capablanca. White would love to exchange minor pieces here as long as they're the right minor pieces. Black plays knight to C6. Now white's not going to take this knight. The bishop is a much better minor piece than the knight. Castles from white. Now knight G to E7. Supports the knight, prepares short castling, and also blocks the E file so that there are no checks there. Knight B to D2. We see that Capablanca is preparing knight to B3, where both knights can control this blockading square at D4. Castles, then knight to B3, hits the bishop. The bishop can go to D6 or B6. Both are perfectly good squares for the bishop. Rubinstein chooses B6, where the bishop keeps aim at the king and also keeps the D4 square under control. Rook to E1, the rook to the open file. Bishop to G4, hitting the knight. And a good move here is maybe C3. That adds to the control of D4. But Capablanca just moves the bishop back to D3 with a threat here of playing a bishop to H7 check. And when the king takes, we can try to visualize this. The knight would then go to G5, delivering check to the king, and then queen takes G4. If you try to visualize that, bishop H7, king takes, knight G5, followed by queen takes bishop. Now, Rubinstein, of course, would never allow that, so he plays knight to G6, blocking that diagonal, and also at some point in the future, he might jump into H4 and put pressure on this F3 knight. H3, it's the bishop, bishop takes, queen takes. So at a glance, it looks like Capablanca is just clearly better. He has a healthier pawn structure and the bishop pair. There is, it's not quite true though. Black is actually fine here. For one thing, he can get rid of that bishop pair advantage very quickly. And also this pawn has a lot of dynamic potential. Rubinstein plays knight C to E5, and that does get rid of the bishop pair. He hits the queen, he hits the light squared bishop, and after queen F5, he takes that light squared bishop off of the board. And here he makes a very interesting and very committal decision. Rubinstein plays D4. So the pawn is more vulnerable on the D4 square, but it is also stronger. It controls more space, and if black can keep that pawn there, it could really give him some nice counterplay. Bishop to D2 from Capablanca. Now queen to F6. We see Rubinstein adding another defender to the pawn and ready to centralize his rooks on the D and the E files. Rook to E4. Capablanca adds a third attacker to the pawn. Rook A to D8. Rubinstein adds a third defender to the pawn, and the fight is building up around that D4 pawn. Capablanca doubles on the e-file. His rooks are definitely more active. Queen to c6. This puts some pressure on c2, but another idea, and I think the main idea, is he wants his queen to control e8. And that way he can exchange off the heavy pieces on the e-file. Here, Capablanca could have taken the pawn. That leads to very complicated positions. He plays g3, playing against this knight at g6, taking away the f4 and h4 squares. Rook f to e8. Now we see Rubinstein challenging that open file, and with the queen at c6, he's able to do that. Bishop to a5 from Capablanca, looking to maybe trade off that bishop at b6, certainly seeking to trade off a defender of the d4 pawn. Rubinstein takes rooks off, queen takes e4, so now black cannot play rook to e8 because the queen would just take. If queen takes e4, rook takes e4, bishop a5, and in a position like this, you have an equal endgame. So that was a possibility if the queens were to come off. But Rubinstein keeps the queens on the board and plays knight to f8. The idea is that the knight can come to e6. Not only does that defend d4, but it blocks the e-file that white controls. So Capablanca goes ahead and takes on c6, pawn takes, and he created some pawn weaknesses here for black to deal with. They're not end-of-the-world pawn weaknesses. Black still has space, but it's just a little something for white to nibble on. And with Capablanca, that could be a big problem. He plays his rook to the 7th rank, putting some pressure on a7. And now Rubinstein plays rook to d5. He hits that bishop at a5, forcing a decision. Either you're going to exchange that bishop off for my bishop at b6, or you're going to move it back. But you have to do something now. And Capablanca goes ahead and takes on b6 and the ab. Okay, so now we see the materials even. Can Capablanca, with his rook on the 7th, generate enough pressure on this pawn structure to get anything or not? Well, he plays rook to b7, directly attacking the pawn at b6. Knight to d7. We see Rubinstein did not want to move his pawns because he knew every pawn move created a weakness, so he was very resistant. He would rather move a piece. So the knight defends the pawn. It also controls b8, so there are no checks on the back rank. Rook to c7. Capablanca goes after the c-pawn now. And here the move c5 might actually have been the best move, but Rubinstein does not want to move pawns, so he plays rook to d6. Now rook to c8 check, forcing the knight back to f8, and knight to d2. So we see a real concrete threat on the board. Capablanca is threatening knight to c4 with a double attack, hitting the rook at d6 and the pawn at b6. And the best move was very hard to find. It was actually, it looks like it was the move d3, just activating the rook after pawn takes, rook takes, knight c4, and then just in this position, black has enough activity with his rook probably to hold that endgame. But instead now he plays c5, and after knight to c4, we see in both cases Capablanca's pieces are more active. The knight's better than the knight at f8, the rook's better placed than the rook at d6. The rook goes to e6, keeping that b6 pawn defended, but now rook to b8. And the knight cannot come to d7 because it's pinned, and the pawn is in a lot of trouble. So rook to e1 check, king to g2. g5 does a few things. It gives his king luft, allowing him to play king g7 and develop the knight. And also it means that if white were to try to play f4, h4, he would have to accept some pawn weaknesses on the king side. a4, rook to a1, just going right after that pawn. Capablanca plays knight to b6, king to g7. Now rook to c8, going after the c-pawn. But knight to e6 defends the pawn. And he says, I'm going to trade off this pawn for this pawn, and plays knight to d7, attacking the pawn twice, but removing the defender of a4. Rubinstein takes. Knight takes c5. Rook to b4, attacking the b2 pawn. And again, we see the resistance. They don't want to move pawns. They'd much rather move pieces. So knight to d3 defends the b2 pawn, as well as attacking Rubinstein's rook. And Capablanca, he's up a pawn, but it's still a tough conversion here. Rook to b5, king to f3, h6, just adding defender here. b4, advancing the passed pawn. Passed pawns want to be pushed. h5, with the possibility of playing h4 and maybe creating a weakness on the f4 square after an exchange, or g4. He goes ahead and plays g4 anyway. Pawns are exchanged. And f6. Rook to c4 from Capablanca, not only defending b4, but adding an extra attacker to the d4 pawn. King to f7, trying to get his king into the game. Now knight to c5, an invitation to a pure rook endgame. If black takes the knight, then Capablanca just takes with the pawn, and this is a very fast pawn. Only 3 squares away from queening. If after, say, king to e8, he can play king to e4, and he's going to win this d4 pawn and have sure, just a winning position there. So Rubinstein plays knight to d8 with a little trickery. If Capablanca goes ahead and takes on d4 here, then knight takes c6, hits the pawn at b4 as well as the rook. And after rook to d7 check, just king to e8. And in this position, black is surviving. The pressure on this pawn, as well as threats of rook takes followed by king takes and so forth. And black can hold this endgame. So instead of taking the pawn, Capablanca makes another move. He plays the move knight to b3. And in this position, black resigned, as there is no way to defend this pawn anymore. And he's just going to be down 2 pawns in an endgame against Capablanca. And there's just, I don't think there's any player in human history that could defend that position, any computer that could defend that position. So Rubinstein resigned in this very hard-fought, very instructive chess endgame. Hope you've enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.